So can I welcome our witnesses today and to those who will be watching online or in the public gallery. And this is our fourth session of our inquiry into mental health of men and boys. And today we're hearing from two panels of witnesses looking at very important areas. The first panel will hear about how sexual violence and abuse and domestic abuse can impact mental health of men and boys and what support is needed. And the second panel will hear about how relationship breakdown can affect men and how family court processes can affect both men and boys. I'd like to suggest for anyone who is personally affected by the issues raised during the first half of this morning's session, they might like to consider calling Survivors UK on 0203 598 3898 or the Men's Advice Line on 0808 801 0327, and I'll make sure those bits of information are on our webpage. And for those affected by any issues during the second half of this morning's oral evidence session, please consider contacting organisations like Relate, either online or by phone, and their number is 0300 003 0396. And before we start our questions today, could I perhaps ask our witnesses to say their name and the organisation they represent, starting with Mark?
Well, thank you very much, Chair. My name is Mark Brooks. I'm the Chair of the Mankind Initiative charity, provide support to male victims of domestic abuse, and we're delivering a number of Home Office funded projects, including supporting police forces.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Canning. I work for a local charity called Operation Emotion. We provide support to men who've been sexually abused. We work in general practice. We provide training. We do campaign work. We use a lot of film to sort of help campaign in the work that we do. And we run educational courses for men to try and help them overcome trauma.
Thank you. Duncan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Duncan Craig. I'm the Chief Executive of Survivors Manchester, an organisation supporting boys and men affected by rape, sexual abuse and sexual violence. I'm also the co-founder of the Men and Boys Coalition, along with Mark, and the Male Survivors Partnership, which is an umbrella organisation working with sexual violence organisations supporting specifically boys and men.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ippo Panteloudakis. I'm Head of Services at Respect. We are a domestic abuse organisation working with domestic abuse perpetrators, male or female, male victims of domestic abuse, and young people's violence in close relationships.
Thank you very much. And we'll start with our questions from Sarah.
Thank you. My questions are really trying to understand the sort of the scale and the impact of sexual violence and abuse on the mental health of men and boys. I'd like to start, if I can, with Duncan and Steve. Approximately how many boys do you think are victims of sexual violence?
International research says that there's 1 in 6, so 1 in 6 of the male population. When we start looking at things like the Crime Survey England and Wales and some of the MOJ and Home Office data, we begin to start kind of having to separate out, I suppose, types of populations as well then, so age and types of crime. So when we're looking at sexual violence, we're looking at rape, for instance. We're averaging around 78,000 victims of rape or attempted rape each year, and of that, 9,000 males. So it works out, as the MOJ said, just over 1 in 10, and that's over the age of 16. Okay. When you then begin to look kind of just underneath it, it's about ONS report from 2017, I looked the other day, is 631,000 males.
And what is the data specific enough that you can say boys, so under 16?
I think it is. And I think ONS, Mark might be able to correct me here, I think ONS can split it out. I think where you have the problem is when we look at kind of academic research, what we're looking at is if women and girls, so if a female is sexually abused as a child, she's taking roughly about, if she doesn't report at the time of something happening, she's taking roughly about 7 years to speak out, whereas males are taking in excess of about 25 years to speak out. So what you then get in the data is you get the number of people who were abused at the time, but the reporting, so it kind of then, CPS data and police data, it all gets a little bit confusing. And unfortunately, no one in the UK yet has done a full-scale review of academic and peer research at the moment.
I mean, I would add to that actually we don't know, I think, is the answer. It's this very simple answer. And we can draw on statistics from a number of different sources, some of which are conflicting. You know, we work, our own organisation works on a basis of 1 in 10 men and 1 in 6 women. Now, that's a complete underestimation, but we choose a conservative, you know, kind of comment really around those figures because it's absolutely defendable. And most people are utterly shocked when they start to factor that up across the population. But the true answer is we don't know. And most of the people, we've worked with 400 men in the last 5 years, and I would say probably 95% of those men have, you know, never disclosed that to the authorities, would never go to the police. And so, you know, what we're looking at is the tip of the iceberg. And what I would say to you as a committee is this is an endemic problem within society that needs some serious attention. If it was some kind of epidemiology around disease, the government would be leaping in to sort of deal with these figures. But I really think this is a huge problem which we know so little about. We have to know so much, don't we, in the society we live in. But actually, this is something we know nothing about, and I would warn the committee to, you know, consider this.
I mean, I'd support that, and I know from your APPG, you know that we don't know, but we've kind of got to find a way of knowing, and I think we've just got to know what we know at the moment. So I think one of the highlights that came out of some of the work that we've done with the MOJ, particularly around when we had the original Male Rape Support Fund, that when the MOJ looked at the data, when we were talking about 9,000 males affected by rape or attempted rape each year, then when we looked at the data in terms of reporting to the police, it was around about 1,550. So one has to ask then, where are the other people? Yeah. Yeah. And reporting to the police is certainly not the bee's knees and end all for everybody. Yeah. But there's something about those 7,450, when you begin to kind of pie chart them and cut them down, and some people report to families, and some people might go to a third sector organisation, and some people might go to a SARC, and at some point there are a group of people, and these are the people that we don't know, that are sat in silence because they do not know that they can speak out.
And can you tell us the impact that it has on mental health, particularly around childhood going into adulthood?
Yeah, so I often have to start with my own declaration. So as a male victim of sexual violence, as a child abuse survivor myself, and as a qualified psychotherapist, I'm always really interested in how did my experience, how is that the same or dissimilar to other people's experiences? So one of the things that we look at in terms of when we're dealing with boys and men who've been affected by child abuse is things around interpersonal stuff, so trust, relationships, trying to kind of get into issues around control. So when you've had the governance of your own body taken away from you, when you've lost the control of essentially what passes this barrier, then, speaking personally, and I know this is for many other men, it feels like you need to spend the rest of your life trying to get back that control, trying to make the past okay, but the past is never okay. So then when you kind of get to a point of one realising that the past is never going to be any different, we're kind of dealing with internalised anger, externalised anger, how that then anger sort of like is actioned, so violence. That's where we kind of then get into it as an external thing, but also an internal thing, so suicide, ideation, self-harm.
Yeah. And Steve, Duncan was talking about sort of if the abuse happened in childhood, what happens if the sexual abuse happens in adulthood? Are you seeing different impacts on mental health?
Same thing. I think sort of male gender stereotyping really prohibits men from actually feeling they can be vulnerable. We know that men are just as vulnerable as women in a lot of ways, and particularly if that occurs during childhood or when they're teenagers. The kind of, I guess the worrying thing really is that, in short, I would say its effect on mental health is it ruins lives. And if men are spending an average of about 30 years in secrecy with this, I mean, they're actually manifesting that in all sorts of different ways, whether it be drug and alcohol, ending up in prison, and we have personal testimony of this from knowledge of the work that we've done. Get petty criminal activity, drugs and alcohol, relationship problems. I mean, these are all symptoms of a trauma that occurred in childhood. And the kind of 4 principles that we work with are really around identity issues, isolation, powerlessness, and issues around trust and betrayal, and they actually manifest themselves in all sorts of very, very bizarre ways. And then, mental health service will pick that up and give people labels, what they should be doing. It's not saying what's wrong with you, but actually what happened to you. That's the inquiry that needs to happen.
So my organisation and I personally, as part of my organisation, we run a trauma-focused clinic within prison, so within one particular prison within Greater Manchester at the moment. We've been doing that for about 3 years now. And we've seen around about 200 men over the past 3 years. All of them score really high on the IESR, so the Impact of Event Scale, which is a self-reporting tool that the NHS use to look at PTSD symptoms. We know that there's about 30% of the male population that have been diagnosed with PTSD, but we also know that PTSD, according to psychiatry, is one of the most underreported mental health conditions. I think when you have somebody who has spent years trying to forget what happened to them, trying to turn the noise down, I think what, as Steve's saying, drugs and alcohol, absolutely. Mental health conditions that come with it, so psychosis, because when you kind of have that level of drug and alcohol use, we have to then start looking at a dual diagnosis. Your question before around the difference between current and non-current, this is only anecdotal, but what I will say is it seems that they're in people who have current issues, so people who have been raped or assaulted in, let's say, in the past 12 months, kind of fit in with data, that there is a much quicker route to self-harming behaviours. So not just physical self-harming like cutting, but neglect of need. That seems to be way more acute than...
Put some more words in. Neglect of need, what do you mean?
So even something as simple as not looking after personal care.
Okay.
So, you something happens, I don't know, you kind of get a cut on your hand and really kind of need seeing to. It's just neglected. This kind of... And it all boils down to self-worth. It boils down to I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of being okay.
And is that tied in with masculinity?
I think it's tied in with gender norms. So the reason I say that is because everyone seems to be talking about toxic masculinity at the moment. And I've just read some stuff and I'm just not too sure it's the right conversation. I think the conversation should be toxic gender norms, not just masculinity, but maleness. I also think that toxic gender norms are really toxic for females as well. I know I really do. So I think it is tied into masculinity, but it's more than that. It's the essence of who you're supposed to be in your gender.
Could I bring you in here with the people you work with? Is what Duncan and Steve saying, is that ringing true with the people you work with?
Yes, we focus on domestic abuse mostly, and I would like to make a comment around the underreporting issue, which is massive. We run some analysis on our database based on the calls that we put in our database, looking for the numbers of those who reported sexual abuse experiences. And there was a massive difference between the gay men and the heterosexual men. Gay men were much more likely to report experiencing sexual abuse and talk a bit more openly about it. Whereas with heterosexual men, we found that only around 1% reported experiencing it. You notice that I'm not saying how many experienced it, but how many reported to our helpline. And as standard practice, we weren't asking, whereas now we are trying to consider how we can introduce that question and bring that subject in and consider sexual abuse in a more structured way as part of their experience. And another issue, again, linking up with gay men, is that when there has been sexual abuse, and there are other issues such as drug and alcohol abuse, it tends to become recurring. And I'm bringing that back to your question about current or past experiences. Once it started happening with certain groups, it keeps happening because that's the way it is, because that's the way they feel a relationship works. And it is okay to have those expressions of your sexuality and your masculinity. And I will agree with Duncan about the toxic masculinity that is perceived by a lot of men as offensive, and I think it is offensive. I think instead we should be talking about if we want to identify something that is not healthy for the men and others around them, perhaps another term to introduce would be harmful aspects of masculinities. Because there isn't one masculinity, there are many expressions and manifestations. And some of those are problematic. And it's not that we are saying that it is wrong about liking fast cars or sports or the opposite sex. It's about the unhealthy aspects, anything to do with violence, turning your emotions outwards in a negative way, etc.
And could I just ask you to speculate about the difference in reporting between gay men and straight men, heterosexual men?
I think gay men are more aware, as well as gay, bisexual and trans men. Trans men particularly experience the highest levels of sexual and domestic abuse. But I think they are more aware that there are some services that are targeted at them. There's more of an identification issue, more of a community. Whereas with heterosexual men, there is the issue of perception of services, but also a systemic issue of the services themselves, of how they present and how they want to become inclusive and how they present themselves to be inclusive of men. So a generic service is more likely to be perceived as a service for women in this context, rather than also a service for men. So there are some added barriers that need to be addressed for men to get a clear message that this service is also for you and it is good and healthy to speak to them.
Yeah.
Final question for me, sorry. I'm assuming that you're talking about contact sexual abuse. Are you seeing increasing online exploitation going on?
Yeah, definitely. So, and just following on from a little bit of what Ippo was just saying then, so in Survivors Manchester we see about 80% of the population that come in for service are self-defined as heterosexual, about 20% self-defined as gay or bisexual, or men who have sex with men. And it's in the LGBT, the gay, bi, trans, where we're beginning to see an increase in a phenomenon that seems to be happening around online stuff. It's certainly not something, and again this is just anecdotal, that I've seen within the mainstream population, which is heterosexual males, and it feels like it's kind of bridging into like revenge porn, and that feels like that's something that we haven't seen before. It feels like that. So all of the media, all of the discussions have been around the way that women have been affected by revenge porn, and it feels like there's just this slow emerging stuff. I'm not saying it is directly linked to, but I'm always really interested in the people who come and talk to us about it are people who are often engaged in chemsex as well. So it feels like actually that would make a bit more sense because there's an online thing with that, particularly around meeting people. Yeah. So you've already got something on somebody, and then there's an exploitation aspect that goes from online to offline as well. But it's a very emerging thing. Yeah.
And just to add very quickly to that, and we have some of the same reports and experiences reported to us, and on top of that, we are getting the sense that this is being normalized, or it has been normalized, that it is okay to exchange intimate photos and having no control of how these are going to be used, men to men, and not reflecting on the impact on your well-being, what that photo might do to your career prospects, to a future partner, a future relationship, how it will emerge and what implications will have 6 months later or 5 years later, and how it can also be used as a tool of abuse and blackmail. We've heard a few stories like that as well.
Thank you, Chair.
Look.
Sarah was asking about sexual violence. Can I turn your attention to domestic abuse? How many men experience domestic abuse, and what form does it typically take? Mark?
Thank you. In terms of the ONS figures, around 695,000 men suffer domestic abuse every year. It's around 1 in 3 of all victims. Around 160,000 go to the police, but only about 5% of the people who actually access domestic abuse services are actually men. In terms of other figures, especially around who do they tell, about half don't tell anybody if they're a victim at the hands of a partner, and nearly all are suffering from emotional and psychological abuse, with, depending on the research, at least 1 in 10 thinking about suicide from the ONS figures, but Women's Aid have done some really good research that suggests about 50% of men who are going through domestic abuse have thought about taking their own life.
Has anyone else got anything that they want to add to that?
The men's, but I agree with what Mark said about the impact and most of the official figures. The Men's Advice Line this summer alone had reports of 2 suicides of men who were experiencing domestic abuse. Even yesterday, a mother called to tell us that she was planning the funeral of her son who had been in an abusive relationship for 10 years, and they were encouraging him to access help and support. They found services for him, helplines, and he just wouldn't. And that's how it ended. Extremely sad, and it wasn't inevitable. That's the thing.
We've always, so whenever we get a call or during our kind of assessment process, if we see anybody or if we hear of any man that's come for services and is involved within a domestic abuse setting, then we'll always refer them through to Mark or Men's Advice Line. The one thing that I will say is it seems to be beginning to be talked about a little bit more ever since the BBC Three documentary. It felt like everybody in our service wanted to just talk about Alex Steele, the abused by my girlfriend. And it feels again like that's some of that thing that when the media begin to talk about something, it's like permission giving, it makes it okay. So we've just begun to start collecting a little bit of data that if anybody, not necessarily screening for it, but if anybody says it, then we just kind of record it just to see what the phenomenon is.
So following on from that, what struck me about those figures that you gave, Mark, was that there's so many men that experience domestic abuse, but so few report it, and even fewer seek help. So why is that? Why do so few report it, and why do so few seek help?
I think there's 3 key areas, if I may. First of all, the first area is around masculinity and the barriers that can present in terms of shame and embarrassment, lack of understanding that they're actually a victim of domestic abuse, and a real sense of helplessness, and really undermines what it means to be a man in terms of being strong, resilient, respect, be able to look after others in your family and yourself. So it undermines a man's sense of what it means to be a man. The other areas, and my colleagues have touched upon them, is around societal stereotypes and service provision. A real empathy gap when it comes to vulnerable men in general, which I know has been covered more widely in this inquiry. But for many men, they fear that they won't be believed, they don't know who to tell, the services that are out there are not specifically promoting that they're available for men. Also, while things are getting better within the professional community, we still do see barriers from some police forces, or sort of police officers rather than police forces, some in the domestic abuse sector, also some from local authorities, who are not recognising the symptoms and the causes of domestic abuse as they would for female victims, but that is catching up and is huge strides in the last 5 or 10 years. We used to get a lot of men calling us that had our helpline saying they'd gone to the police and they'd been ridiculed, not taken seriously. And so the way that public provision and societal stereotypes around male victims is getting better, but it's not where it should be. And that provides a barrier to men because they do fear that they won't be believed. They do fear that there aren't services available, and they do fear that the reaction from friends, family, work colleagues and services will be to actually further belittle them. There's issues around public policy as well, in terms of making sure that the discourse in media and the narrative on domestic abuse is far more inclusive, to make sure that obviously it needs to continue to include an emphasis and focus on female victims, but also it needs to have an equal emphasis and focus on male victims, because that's what an inclusive society would expect.
I think we all know that there aren't enough refuges for female victims of domestic violence. What's the provision of refuges for male victims of domestic violence?
The last figures that we've collected is that there's 150 spaces for male victims of domestic abuse across the country. 34 of those spaces are dedicated for men. The other spaces are available for men or women whatever the level of need and availability of those spaces at their time. There are lots of areas in the UK where there aren't enough spaces, especially London and the South East. And of course that isn't just about male victims of domestic abuse. People accessing those services are male victims of forced marriage, for example. And of course that includes men in same-sex relationships. So we need more support for female victims, more refuges and safe houses, but we need more for men as well, including for their children.
And how do we achieve that? What needs to be done to bring about the provision that's required?
Well, I think there needs to be more public political pressure. There needs to be more, especially from central government, also from the police and crime commissioners, and also local councils, to make sure that they're actually complying with the law. Because if you've got a man with children in exactly the same need and level of risk as a woman in the same situation, they need to have access to emergency housing provision and support. And therefore, I suspect there's many areas, councils, who are failing in their public sector equality duty, the Equality Duty and the Care Act in supporting male victims. Some men are having to travel hundreds of miles to find places. We know it's a situation that many women face, but also it's a situation that men face too.
And just finally, do we have any figures on how many boys are exposed to domestic abuse at home and the impact it has on them?
I would say, although I don't have specific figures, I would say that every boy and every girl living in a home where domestic abuse takes place is exposed to domestic abuse. Whether they witness it directly or indirectly, children know, children feel, they understand if there is tension, they see the bruises, they will hear the arguments, the fights. So everyone will be affected. It's very difficult to quantify.
I suppose the quantification is however many people are what's the total number of families that are engaged in domestic abuse, domestic violence, and how many of those families have children.
Does it affect boys in a different way to girls being exposed to domestic abuse?
From purely anecdotal, so from a point of view of working with some families in a therapeutic way, I think there is I'm not too sure I'd stick my neck out and say it affects them differently. I think they're sometimes exposed differently. So I think there's much more of a kind of a protection of girls to kind of get them out of the way than there is for boys. I just think it's the way we think about the resilience of boys compared to the resilience of girls.
If I could come in, there's been some work from Professor Nicola Graham-Cavan at the University of Central Lancashire on trauma from children exposed to domestic abuse when they're growing up, and they're more likely to be a perpetrator or or a victim in their adult life by a factor of about 4, that's for boys and girls. But in terms of boys, when they're going through or seeing it in their household, and obviously they have adverse childhood experiences, and the thing is that when they're exhibiting those experiences through school, for example, poor performance, bad behaviour, abusive behaviour towards their colleagues, for example, and just being poorly behaved, the way that the education system actually supports them is different because of the stereotypes around boys. So if boys are badly behaved, they think that that's just because that's the way boys are, and they're not looking at what is actually going on in the household. Whereas if a girl is in that situation, the schools and the authorities are more likely to look behind the curtain to see if there's any household issues causing that, when it's boys exhibiting those behaviours because they've seen their parents in abusive relationships, the same level of inquiry or professional curiosity is not taking place.
I mean, I think we're sort of hung up really with academic attainment in schools to the extent that we overlook some of the most important and fundamental principles of a child's journey through school, and that is, around child protection and safeguarding. They're just not as important. I mean, and if we're looking at sort of exclusions from school, it's extremely worrying. And homeschooling, where people are completely unprotected children, that is, are completely unprotected, and that's a serious issue. I mean, it just needs to have the status that perhaps math, science, and English does, and it doesn't. So we're trying to sort of change hearts and minds around that and get some of the academy trust to begin to look at this rather than just worry constantly about actually academic attainment, because if you're not healthy and happy in school, how the hell do you learn? This is the important thing.
And another impact being that both boys and girls learn, and they take the message that it is okay to resolve conflict in relationships with violence and abuse, and at some point in their lives they will perpetuate those behaviors, either or exposed to them in future life, either as perpetrators themselves or victims. And it's hard to predict how this journey will unfold, but they get a very clear message that when things go wrong, you use violence, you use abuse, and that is okay, it's normalized. So it's passed on from generation to generation.
I think for boys and for men, if they're sort of victims of trauma in childhood particularly, then what they will do is often shut down a lot of their emotions, and women use their emotions and practice those much more. And what you find with men is the first one they'll reach for is anger, and as Duncan was saying earlier on, that's not always outward anger. That could be, some people would argue that depression is a form of inverted anger. Mm-hmm. So these kind of things really affect people's mental health and their libido, their ability to grow as an adult and to enjoy full citizenship. And it's very, very, very worrying. What we're doing is just seeing the casualty after casualty after casualty. Mm-hmm. What we should be doing is picking it up a lot earlier. What we should be doing is having a bit more of a campaign across government. And, in the Quality Outcomes Framework, which I've had a bit to do with I work with GP practice, there is no mention of sexual abuse or sexual violence in the Quality Outcomes Framework, which is very, very worrying.
Before we move on, can I just say that there'll be people here listening today who aren't as aware of domestic abuse against men. Are there types of domestic abuse that are particularly likely to affect men, and are there any differences, compared with women? Ippo.
I would say that men are more likely to report emotional abuse than physical abuse, and that may partly be explained by the fact that women usually tend to be, I don't want to give stereotypes, less strong physically, and there are other ways that they can achieve the same goal. And one of the top things that we keep hearing again and again and again is that she told me that if I were to leave, I would never see the children again. One of the most effective strategies. It works, and he doesn't even question it. He just believes it. There is another way that is very common is how the perpetrator will use the man's gender, his masculinity, his maleness, to abuse him. If you were a real man, you would be providing more, and we've had many stories from men who have taken on loans and are in debt because they wanted to provide that extra more to fulfill that ideal. If you were a real man, you would be a different person or whatever, and that resonates. It hits him very, very hard, and also fatherhood. Convincing that he's not a good father, and some of those can happen the other way around with male perpetrators and female victims. I'm not saying that they don't happen, but these are very, very common. There are also specific experiences for LGBT men that don't apply necessarily to heterosexual men. Some information from the Safe Lives report, Free to Be Me, says that LGBT survivors are twice as likely to have self-harmed or have attempted suicide, or twice as likely to have been abused by family members, which tells us that it's particularly high within young LGBT people. And twice the use of drug and alcohol than their heterosexual counterparts. So all of these impacts are linked with the experiences that gender and sexuality, that the intersection brings in the mix. I'll leave it at that.
Mark, you're nodding vigorously. Do you want to add anything?
No, I've got
to
nothing to add to that.
Okay, Stephanie.
Thank you. I just want to ask a few further questions on the support available. What mental health support is currently available for men who have been victims of either sexual abuse or domestic violence?
Well, I suppose straight away we have to say that there's anybody can access GP surgery. There's the whole IAPS, the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, and actually quite a few IAPS services now across the country are beginning to think about themselves as being more trauma-informed, particularly at a higher level, step 3 level. In terms of sexual violence services, there's about 130 organisations across the UK that are working with either boys and men solely, or boys and men, women and girls in a equal or equitable way. And then there's a small proportion, I think it's about 60 from the top of my head, I can certainly send you the data at a later date, who are organisations that are specifically working with women, and then they'll do something for men. So they might have an evening they can access a telephone phone line. It's in desperate need of actually some really good trauma-informed support. We know within Survivors Manchester, so we were very heavily involved with the Coronation Street David Platt rape storyline, and following the airing of the story in the 72 hours that followed, where the National Male Survivors Helpline we got a 1,700% increase in calls. My own organisation, we had a 65% increase in requests for support. We're seeing, we're getting 3 brand new referrals every single day of the year. This isn't just in the week, it's Monday to Sunday. So what we do know is, and when I speak to my colleagues at Rape Crisis England and Wales, and my colleague over at Rape Crisis in Greater Manchester, is that there seems to be, both for females and for males, a huge increase. But following some quite high profile cases, particularly the football case, I think when Steve Walters and the guys particularly sat on the Victoria Derbyshire show and said, "This is us," kind of Me Too, I think it gave people permission. And I don't think we've caught up with the support aspect of it yet. I just generally don't.
I mean, I'd say certainly in, we service Devon and Cornwall, which is a massive area for a small charity. The paucity of services for men is, we're probably one of the only organisations in that area that can provide support. And that's really worrying when people have to travel, 50, 60 miles routinely to access our services. We do try and do a bit of peripatetic work, but that would suggest that there are inadequate services. I would say, it would be woefully inadequate for women and almost non-existent for men. That would be our view, particularly for where we are.
I mean, when I kind of broke my silence 14 years ago, the closest place for me in Manchester was in Wiltshire, so I travelled down to Wiltshire. I had the funds to do it, but many people don't. And since then, there was 4 organisations for males, specifically for males then. A couple have closed and a few more have opened, and we've got, specifically for males now, we've got 9 across the UK.
Yeah. Which is not a lot.
2 of us sat here.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Sorry for shutting you down today.
In 2018, it was announced that as part of the 5-year strategy to support mental health for victims of sexual assault that, and I quote, there would be an improved provision for men. What has, if anything, this meant in practice?
Well, I could say, I mean, are you referring to the MOJ funds? I mean, we applied to do some work in Dartmoor Prison. We had the support of the governor, the deputy governor, the head of probation, the local safeguarding. I mean, we actually wrote a very comprehensive application, which was greatly supported and viewed by everybody. And we weren't successful due to the fact we didn't have the capacity to do 1 day a week work in a prison. It was worrying. We since applied again in the next round at MOJ funding, and were told that we didn't really have the experience in working with men who've been sexually abused. Well, we've been doing this for 10 years non-stop, which is kind of confusing when you challenge that. And then the money is given to another organisation in the city to run a helpline, and promptly then they ring us up and say, could you take all these people and deal with them, because we can't. So I mean, looking at what happened in the last round, I think one of the things that I was told was that they actually decided to fund things that they'd funded before, which is not very helpful from a growth point of view. So, yeah, I mean, we found that quite frustrating, really.
So, I think you might be talking about SAS, this Sexual Abuse and Assault Services. So, it's a cross-government, cross-department led by NHS England. I was part of the development of that, along with colleagues from many other organisations. What has happened since? So we've had many meetings. We've got quite a few ideas flowing. There is certainly the beginnings of a better development, a better way of working. But I can't honestly say that a lot on the floor as a male survivor, if I wasn't involved in this, what would I see? I'm not too sure what I would see. I'm not saying there isn't, I'm just not too sure what I would see. But what I will say is there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
And the final question, you have mentioned some things, but what do you think needs to be improved?
I think, I mean, like the thing that I always jump to is I think what we have massively improved is, for the first time ever, we have a government position statement on boys and men affected by VOG. We have a CPS position statement on boys and men affected by VOG, which is fantastic, and I am so thankful for that. But what happened to me is still described as something that happened to a woman or a girl, and I'm not. I'm a big boy now, and I'd like to be recognised. So I think what we've got to do is I think we've got to find a way of developing strategy where VOG can be VOG, because I think the danger in mixing some stuff up, so if you look at the CPS reports, is that everybody thinks it's VOG, as in violence against women and girls, but the data includes boys and men. So what are we actually talking about? And I think what we need is a separate strategy. And I think the strategy has got to not just have a strategy for boys and men because there's one for women and girls, but look at the issues. So myself and Mark on the trustee board of the Men and Boys Coalition, I have like some debates with some of my fellow trustees because I wonder whether a strategy for boys and men should include something like knife crime, should include suicide. It shouldn't just be, here's a whole load of things that disproportionately affect women and girls, or we think disproportionately affect women and girls, so let's just add them over to this. We need some proper thinking about it. We need to look at what are the key issues that men and boys are dealing with in an interpersonal violence way.
Really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, from a public health perspective, I think there's a lot more that could be done, and I've mentioned the quality outcomes framework. That should really begin to recognise and actually encourage GPs through financial remuneration to actually ask the question, because they're in a unique position. So sort of generic services. I mean, what we're a small organisation that ends up dealing with the casualties. That can't go on. What we've got to do is actually start to work much more in prevention. So we've mentioned a bit about schools. So there's definitely, and certainly across public health, I think it needs to be taken more seriously. And given some view in society where we can have a healthy debate about it, because, you know, sexual abuse really operates in a very penumbra world. We've just got to actually have the courage to step forward and shine some light into it as a society, as we are all responsible. You know, I'm as equally as responsible as anybody to actually make sure that we have those sorts of debates. And, you know, just simply thinking that it might be footballers or wealthy people's kind of issue is, I mean, that's such a small percentage of the perpetrators that are around. You know, 80% of stuff happens in family homes. You know, 90% of people have a prior relationship with their victim perpetrators. So, I mean, those are kind of issues that strike right at the heartland of what we know, which is family life. We've got to have the courage to step forward and say a bit more about that.
If I could add, just if I may, I mean, the more services that are available for men, irrelevant of who runs them, but as long as they're very clearly aimed that they have a male service to their overall domestic abuse service, that's really important. So men realise that service is available to them, and there's tailored communications, parts of websites. That's really important. In terms of the narrative on domestic abuse, you know, I've spoken about the need for it to be more inclusive. We are getting there. The government is making, I was really pleased in the domestic abuse bill that the definition will be gender neutral. We need to make sure that the guidance fully underpins that domestic abuse bill, takes into account male victims, including men in same-sex relationships, and also the public policy. You know, Duncan talked about the VALG strategy. That really actually gives a clear indication to commissioners at a local and regional level that these services really should be just focused or primarily focused on women and girls. And we need to keep the violence against women and girls strategy, but we need to look at a different way to make sure that those commissioners are recognising men and boys in that same situation. And the last Victims Commissioner actually supported a parallel strategy, and a number of charities out there support that as well, in parallel to what we've got from the brilliant work for women and girls.
I mean, you've also got reported crime. Those are the statistics we know about. What we should be doing is actually getting the OPCC. So we've certainly lobbied like hell with our local OPCC, who agreed to do it in the end, to actually, you know, take some notice of unrecorded and victims of sexual abuse and fold those back to MOJ. So that's happening, but that could happen manifestly right across the country, and that would really help to actually begin to give us a better idea of the enormity of the problem, I think. I mean, it's a disaster we're involved with. We've just got to recognise that, I think.
I think we need to make special mention as well, and really make sure that we understand the needs of other communities. So trans communities, I think trans communities, we're desperately failing them in the sexual violence world. I also think that I've just been in Uganda with the Refugee Law Project, looking at boys and men affected by rape during conflict and displacement. And I came back to England with a heavy heart, because I'm not too sure that we are working with boys and men, or even seeing boys and men who have been displaced. I also think that we need to desperately support and work with communities of faith and communities of ethnicity. I don't think that we fully understand that. And I sometimes wonder if we even understand class as well. You know, so it's kind of getting underneath it all. I think we've just got to be brave, and I think we've got to. It's taken a while, but we're certainly getting to a point within the sexual violence sector where we're kind of reaching out across the line. So organisations that for 20, 30, 40 years have worked specifically with females and done an incredible job, and I'll say this for the millionth time, it's because of those women that I can do what I can do. And I mean, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. The kind of Lee Eggleston, Sheila Coates, the kind of the women of rape crisis that enable me to do my job now, enable me to step forward. And, you know, we've begun to have a discourse, we've begun to have a narrative that doesn't mean, if we're talking about men and boys, that is negating women and girls. we've got to move beyond this and be able to have some really adult conversations without people kind of doing that. And I'm all for that, and I know that many of my female counterparts are, but we've just got to, I think government's got to be brave, and you know, this I think is really brave.
Can I just take this forward a little bit? Mark, you talked about potentially the need for a parallel strategy for men and boys. Duncan, you're sort of hinting at the need to perhaps have a cohesive strategy, and I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong, but I'm just interested in that, because it practically for government that's quite a different approach to have one strategy which might include everybody who's experiencing domestic abuse or sexual violence, and another is to have a parallel strategy. How did government make its mind up on that?
Post-Chair, just sorry to correct, I'm definitely in the camp of having a parallel strategy rather than a cohesive strategy.
You hinted, and I thought that was quite interesting, that there might be a way of trying to pull this together. Maybe I was wrong.
I think certainly I want Vogue to be Vogue, and I want a parallel strategy that's looking at the different needs of boys and men. And I think
we need to do that as a stepping stone, maybe, to have a parallel strategy which eventually we might be able to roll together.
I think it's probably the safest way forward,
right.
And I think it's probably a sensible way forward. Really, I just want a parallel strategy now, but I think we've got to take baby steps, because I think there's lots of very nervous people about it for absolutely hearts and minds reasons.
You want to come in?
Yes, I think there is a reason why we have a Vogue strategy. There is a certain context and globally, and that has all those issues underneath that. So we would need to find something equivalent for men and boys, what the issues are, and we shouldn't be including something that talks with compassion about the things that men do wrong, perhaps that they perpetrate violence or the issues around harmful aspects of masculinity as we were talking about earlier. I can see a strategy that would include those elements, as well as how men are abused as men and as boys sexually and in other ways, and why is it that the majority of homicide victims are male in society, men killing other men, we know that, knife crime, and a lot of other unhealthy, unhelpful and unsafe behaviors. So this strategy, call it parallel, call it whatever you like, I don't want to define it right now, but it can include all those issues that talk about what it means to be a man today in whatever way you feel comfortable, but that it's good for you and it's healthy for you, and you develop your masculinity and your maleness without it impacting negatively on others, and having a system of protection when others impact negatively on you as a victim, or any kind of victim. So it's not about taking away, as the other panelists have said, away from anything that is for women and girls. That should remain and continue and strengthen possibly. But it's about finding what is particular about men. So we need something that is gender informed, because that's what we're looking at, what is different between men and women. Putting everything in the same basket means that someone's needs are not going to be met. And I think women's needs are not being met adequately either within this context.
The reason why I pressed on that a little bit is because on a number of occasions the committee's heard concern about the way in which local authorities are commissioning gender-neutral services, particularly around domestic abuse. And the reason for that being often a very poor understanding of what the public sector equality duty is, and the need to put forward the needs of the individual over and above anything else. So I just wanted to flesh that out through this conversation, just so that I got your perspective. Ippo and then Mark. Yeah.
For me, there is no such thing as gender neutral. The table is gender neutral. People have a gender and associate with a certain gender, and they socialize with the gender. And very, very young boys and girls, they get to behave in a certain way that they learn from other boys or from other men. So gender is out there. We cannot ignore it. Gender neutral probably means one size fits all, so that we can tick certain boxes and allocate some money. But no one's needs are met adequately this way, women's or men's. It has to be something that is proportionate and relevant for each community, wherever that community is, and that can be different from one community to another, including, for example, the refugees. We may need to look at a different model of providing that safe space that is not necessarily a refuge for women or men in future, something that will be a different net of protection. But if we keep our minds within the context of so many refuges for women, perhaps we should be having another 25 for men. That may be just about good enough today, but it won't be good enough in 5 or 10 years' time, and we'll have wasted millions of pounds that we probably will not have on something that may be underused, or it will not offer the protection that we want people to have.
I mean, just on the gender neutral, I mean, what the commissioners are doing, local councils, Ofsted working with the clinical commissioning groups and also the police and crime commissioners, they're commissioning services to make sure that every individual who's at risk or is a victim of domestic abuse is actually supported, and they have a legal duty to do that under the Equality Act. The way they commission those services is now to just commission one service, but that does not mean that service cannot offer a service for female victims and a slightly different service for male victims, or make it clear so that it's available for women and men. A concern about when people say, well, gender neutral services, that's taking away something from women, and that is a risk. But the issue is that commissioning authorities have a legal duty to support male victims and their children. So I think, if I'm being honest, I think it's a bit of a red herring, that argument, because what it's really saying is that we wouldn't just commission services for women, and we're not worried about men who are going through domestic abuse. I think there's a political narrative to that.
The written evidence that we've received also suggests that Australia and Ireland have developed best practice regarding supporting men's mental health. Mark, Duncan, do you want to comment on that?
I know in Australia they've been doing quite a lot of work, particularly around the Royal Commission, around developing a kind of strategy for mental health. That's very gender inclusive and gender specific as well. And I think that's something that we've certainly been missing here. I think this thing about gender neutral, we talk about gender neutral services sometimes in mental health, and actually the mental health of women, particularly when you look at kind of maternity services, there's some very specific needs for women in those services. But then also, we need some very specific needs for mental health services for men as well. And I just think sometimes we need to think about our language and think that if we have strategies, if we have something that gives us a framework to think about developing better services, then I think it helps commissioners, I think it helps service leads, and I think it helps the public understand as well.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, the fact that Australia and Ireland have a men's health strategy is really important, a real marker. And I think the government more widely needs to look at having a similar strategy in the UK, or certainly in England and Wales. And we saw the suicide figures that came out yesterday, big increase in the number of male suicides and an increase in female suicides. And what's concerning about those figures is the fact that often male suicide increases when there's a recession. And the fact is we're not in a recession anymore, and therefore why have those figures have gone up? We don't have a suicide prevention minister anymore. I think that went with the reshuffle over the summer. I think reinstatement of that would be really important. And also it would make sure that there was a focus on male suicide as well as enabling a focus on female suicide. So we need to step up more in terms of the government and public policy on this particular issue. Others are doing it brilliantly in Ireland and Australia. Why can't we?
Thank you. The very first session we had some survivors come and speak to us, and I was really struck that they were saying that the support services that are there are very sort of feminine in their presentation, in the language that they're using. Counselling is seen as sort of a woman's talking shop, and I just wonder, from what you've been saying, has there been either any research done? Because I was particularly struck about the. You were saying within the gay community there was more of an acceptance that you could come forward and talk about it. So has there been any public health campaigns? Has there been any research? Because just providing a service, if people don't feel able to access it, isn't good enough. So what needs to happen so that men feel able to step over that threshold?
We haven't had a public health campaign. What we've had some, particularly around funding announcements. So both Home Office and MOJ have done some specific targeted stuff around, particularly originally the Male Rape Support Fund and then subsequent support funds. That kind of gives men permission to step forward. Where things have really took off is going back to what I was saying before, Alex Skeel's documentary, Coronation Street, Hollyoaks. So on Hollyoaks we did a big piece of work with them to look at the football abuse story that was based on Steve Walters' story. And Steve helped me with the writers and we developed it. We had an ISVA, the first time on British soap opera we'd ever had an ISVA. I looked at our data, and really interestingly, during this period of time, more young men were ringing up Survivors Manchester asking for ISVAs. Wow. It's not a formal campaign, but what we know is that kind of media, the stuff that's out there in the media, the social media stuff, but also the very traditional media, it really helps people step forward. We have, so the Male Survivors Partnership has developed, thanks to Lloyd and the Home Office and Ministry of Justice, we developed the male quality standards. And what we know is that as people begin to accept them, and begin to try and work through them to accreditation, that there's some organisations that haven't been able to do it because there's certain criteria. So even something as simple as, if you're working with men, do you have male staff? Do you have male representation on your board of trustees? If you've got an expert advisory panel of service users, are there males on there? Some organisations' constitutions doesn't allow that. So then that means that they can't meet quality standards, but yet are still being funded to work with men. And there was during the research that we did for the quality standards as they were being developed, there was one service user that anonymously that wrote into the survey that said during his trial, but just prior to his trial, he went to see his ISVA, and the ISVA was brilliant. He had a really brilliant experience with his ISVA, but he could only ever see his ISVA in Costa Coffee, because the building that the support service was housed in was a female-only building. And I kind of like question that and think, actually, how does that even happen? So we haven't had research. We need it. And we certainly, go back to what you were saying, this public health, we need some public health campaigns around it.
We're running very tight on time, so I'm going to have to draw this first panel to an end, but I have to say thank you to all of you for an incredibly helpful session and a very thought-provoking, and as somebody was saying, ground that needs to be covered more. Thank you all. Can we move to our next panel of witnesses? And just reminding colleagues we're running over a little.